Hi, it's Charlie Minato from halfwheel.com, and in front of me right here is the Colibri Heritage Humidor. This is a brand new humidor for 2019. Retails for $495 and it's advertised as a 125 count humidor. And there's plenty to talk about with this, but before I get started, I actually need to go back about 5 years in time and talk about a different humidor from Colibri. And so this is that humidor. It's the Colibri Quasar humidor. This is the second iteration of it. The first one came out in 2014. It was slightly larger, about this big, and it had the exact same pattern. The only difference was that it was larger and it had this gunmetal or matte black color to it as opposed to the red. The next year they came out with this humidor, which is a 100 count version, and then they came out with a larger gunmetal version as well. So this retailed for $1,500. The larger one was just under $2,000, and these were the first in what became a series of Quasar accessories that exist today. So we've got things today like cutters. This is a lighter. And then right here I have one of the Quasar ashtrays, and you can see that all of them feature this pattern. And the pattern actually came off of a Colibri electric lighter from the 1960s. Colibri took that pattern, really enlarged it, and obviously started making the shape prominent on a lot of accessories, these sort of being the most prominent versions of it. So for the humidor, if you've never seen one of these, it will look very familiar to you if you have a Daniel Marshall humidor, and that's because it was a collaboration with Daniel Marshall, and the inside of the humidor is essentially a Daniel Marshall humidor. So you open it up, it looks like a 100 count Daniel Marshall. It was made by him obviously, but it uses the Daniel Marshall hygrometers, the humidifier cover. The only real difference, to be quite honest, as someone that's owned quite a few Daniel Marshall humidors at this point, is that normally there's a Daniel, like a gold finished Daniel Marshall logo right here. And then the other thing is that, sorry, right here, there's a Colibri logo that's obviously not on most Daniel Marshall humidors. But otherwise, this is the exact same thing that you would get. The outside's made of Honduran mahogany, and then they added this sort of finish. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with Daniel Marshall humidors, while they are, I think, a good value for heirloom quality American-made humidors, they're not cheap. So most of them range for about $1,000 is kind of what you're looking at for anything other than the super small ones, although he's started to add some quite affordable options going forward. But obviously, when Daniel Marshall has to sort of make profit on his end of the humidor and Colibri needs to make profit and the retailer needs to make profit, that's how you end up with a 100 count humidor that's $1,500, which is not something, if we're being honest, that's particularly commercially viable. So Colibri this year surprised us with a new humidor that immediately reminded me and plenty of others of this particular humidor, and that's that Heritage humidor that I showed you at the beginning. So the first difference is quite obvious. This humidor looks a lot more interesting than this, but it still has that grid-like pattern and it's still using shapes. And one of the more subtle things that I really appreciate is there's no logos anymore on the humidor. So as an art piece, well, it might not be as interesting as this humidor. I do think the Heritage humidor still works, particularly given that it looks like a modern humidor. It doesn't really look like what you would expect to be in the back of your grandfather's office, if that makes any sense. Unless, of course, your grandfather's quite cool, like mine is. So if you open up the humidor, you will notice that some things are falling out and also look quite familiar. So in fact, the hygrometer is the exact same as the Daniel Marshall hygrometer. Now, Daniel Marshall's hygrometer is not a proprietary hygrometer to him. You can find it, although it's not the easiest hygrometer in the world to find, and I don't really know of any other humidor manufacturer using it, but it is a off-the-shelf component that you can buy. You'll also notice that the Colibri humidor does have a humidor or humidifier cover, so you're not having to look at the ugly plastic humidifier. Obviously, they're both red, albeit not the same shade of red, and the layout of the humidor is actually quite similar. Now, this humidor is slightly larger. It's a 125 count humidor, though I think 100 cigars is probably even more than I would recommend for it. This is a 100 count humidor, though I've been barely able to get about 60 in there, and even that's kind of a stretch. Neither one of them have trays, but there's other things that are rather remarkably similar. If you actually look at sort of the hardware material here, they're not identical. There's some subtle differences. The Colibri has 2 screws per sort of surface, whereas this only has 1 screw. But if you close the humidors, you can't really tell this on camera, and turn them around, they look sort of how the mechanism with the latch looks is pretty much identical. Now, I don't know what the Colibri humidor is made of. They haven't responded to my emails asking them that question, so I don't know if it's also Honduran mahogany, but it wouldn't surprise me. It's very, very similar. And I don't think this is unintentional, and I really think that Colibri realized they had a successful model here, they just couldn't really sell that many of them. And so what they did is they made a much cheaper version that's maybe not as cool. But we'll put this one away for the second and take you through sort of a full tour of the Heritage Humidor. So there are some things that I actually do like quite a bit more on this humidor than the Daniel Marshall. And it really kind of boils down to this humidifier right here. So this is magnetic, and the entire lid here is magnetic. So you can sort of turn this around. You can knock your humidifier out, I guess. So you can put this wherever you want, and you also can remove it completely. For those of you that have seen some of my reviews of Daniel Marshall humidors, I'm really annoyed that his version of the humidifier cover is completely fixed and there's no way of removing it without utterly damaging the humidor. Now, unfortunately, one thing that's not particularly great is that the humidor itself, the lid isn't large enough to fit the sort of small Boveda magnetic tray here option, so you can't use this as a sort of stock replacement. However, what you can do is take out the included humidifier, and while this looks a little bit better than your normal Fluorous foam humidifier, it is in fact Fluorous foam. Now you can easily undo these screws and replace that with beads inside if you really were hell-bent on using this, but the other option, which is what I would recommend doing, and which is what I've been doing, is you just take your Boveda pack and you just sort of smush it in here. It really shouldn't be this challenging. And then, you know, you've got your Boveda pack relatively hidden. It's not as elegant maybe as putting this in there, but it is functional. And you probably want to put 2 or 3 Boveda packs in this humidor. I don't think you could get 2 or 3 of the 60-gram packs inside there. Now, like I said, it has the same humidifier as the Daniel Marshall humidor. I find those to be quite terrible. If you read the review, you can see some evidence or some data points that I've pulled. We've done some pretty extensive testing on these because we have a lot of them in the office, and they are quite awful in terms of keeping accurate humidity. Even after being calibrated, they're still not great. Like I mentioned, there is no tray. I would say this is probably the absolute maximum of a humidor in terms of a humidor that doesn't have a tray. Anything beyond that, you definitely would want one. There also really isn't any room for a tray, so it's not like you could add one after the fact. There just isn't that much clearance from the top of these dividers, and then there's nothing that would help to prop up the tray. You certainly could take the dividers out and retrofit that solution if you wanted to, although that seems like it's probably a bit of overkill. Now, in terms of performance, I will admit that this is not a long-term testing review that we normally do with humidors here at Halfwheel, but I have been using this quite extensively for the last 3 or 4 months, and I'm pleased to say that this is a fantastic humidor. I actually think that this humidor is better at keeping humidity in than this one, which is something I would have never expected. When I close the humidor, I can feel and hear sort of an audible rush of the air sort of being pushed out as the vacuum is created. And when I go to lift this up, there's definitely much more of that vacuum effect than I have on this particular humidor. And so I think it's a great box in terms of keeping humidity. There hasn't been any issues, but once again, it's been a pretty short-term test. As far as downsides to this humidor, there's a couple things. So the first is the hygrometer that I've mentioned before. It's not great. The second thing, and you probably can't notice it on camera, but I will put up a video, is that right here on this corner, there is a little bit of paint that hasn't been fully applied, or there's paint missing. So there is a little bit of part of the humidor right around here where the fit and finish isn't as good as it should be. But otherwise, if I look around the humidor, it's otherwise perfect. And to be quite honest, I'm not sure that I could have picked this up unless I wasn't doing the sort of full, let me investigate every, sort of pixel, if that makes sense, on the humidor. But other than that, the rest of it's kind of subjective. I do find it very annoying as someone that has OCD that Colibri can't make their colors consistent, particularly their red, because I do like red objects. So you'll notice that this is one color. This is another color or another shade of red. This is actually not too far off of this. Under the lights, it looks quite close. This is a bit more saturated, I would say, than the humidor is. And then this is much brighter and much more saturated, which you definitely can tell on camera, than anything else. And it's not great. You try to sort of put all these things on if you try to put them on display, they don't really look like they belong. One of them looks like a bad knockoff of the other one, if that makes any sense. Now, in fairness, the Heritage Humidor is not part of the Quasar series, and in fairness to Colibri, one of the reasons why they have issues with this is that these are different materials. This is definitely metal. This is wood, as we've gone over. This is also metal, although not the same metal that's on here, and so you don't end up with the same colors. Now, here's the kicker. This humidor is $495 is the suggested retail price. You can easily find this humidor for under $400 for $399. This humidor is $1,500 and also is a little bit smaller. If given the choice, if money was no object, to pick between the two of them, I would probably still get this one, the Quasar, but only because of how it looks, and I think it functions well enough that it's fine. If I was forced to pick just based off of how the humidor functions, this is the much better humidor. The lid means that you aren't losing all that space for covering up the humidifier. It seems like the seal is better on this humidor. It's a little bit larger. And there's other small little things. The magnetic lid is awesome compared to something like this, where you're losing all this space up here. Now, that hurt. With that all said, I'm not sure that it really comes down to it. This was limited. These are sold out. This is brand new and not limited. And for under $400, I think this is one of the best humidors that you can find on the market. I think that it's one of the best humidors that we've reviewed here at Halfwheel, and I would highly recommend this humidor, particularly if you're looking for something, as I oftentimes am, that doesn't look like your sort of stereotypical old man's humidor. So I think Colibri continues to sort of push the bounds and be a leader when it comes to design and sort of semi-affordable cigar accessories. Certainly this might be pushing that limit. But I think that they are definitely doing one of the better jobs in terms of an accessory company. And if you have to have accessories like we have here at the office where you want to put them on display, I think Colibri is certainly the leader when it comes to making items that look pretty and don't cost as much as a Kia. So for more reviews of humidors, cigar accessories, cigars, cigar news, legislation, we're putting some B-roll up probably over my face at this point, you should obviously check out halfwheel.com. And if you're looking for a humidor, I would highly recommend the Colibri Heritage Humidor.